The gun was already out of its holster before Evelyn Finley even realized her hand had moved. She stood in the middle of the dusty road, her chest heaving, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way that would have horrified her late mother. And she stared at the man across from her with something that was not anger and was not love, but was some terrible, violent mixture of both. Cecil Sutton had not moved. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his calloused fingers, watching her with those gray eyes that had always seen too much, and he did not flinch at the gun pointed at his chest. "You were going to leave," she said, and her voice cracked down the middle like old timber. "You packed your horse, Cecil. I saw the bedroll. I saw everything. Evelyn, do not say my name like that. Do not say it like you are the one who is wounded here." The town of Harrow's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, 1884, went very quiet around them. The blacksmith had stopped hammering. The two men outside the saloon had frozen with their drinks halfway to their mouths. A child somewhere behind Evelyn began to cry softly, and its mother hushed it and pulled it away from the street, away from the woman with the gun and the man with the broken expression. "I was not leaving you," Cecil said, and his voice was low and steady and devastatingly careful. "I was leaving so that you could stay. That is the same thing. It is not, and you know it." She cocked the hammer back, not because she intended to shoot him, but because she needed him to understand the magnitude of what he was doing to her, and the click of that mechanism in the hot New Mexico afternoon was as loud as a bell tolling over a grave. "Tell me one honest thing," she said. "One thing. Tell me honestly why you were saddling Ranger at 4 in the morning, without a word to me." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something surrender in him, some fortress wall crumble behind his eyes, and he said the thing that neither of them had been able to say for 3 months, the thing that had been building since the first night they sat together by her fireplace and watched the snow come down in January and pretended that a drifter and a widow had any business falling in love at all. "Because I have slept under more stars than roofs," he said, "and I would trade them all. I would trade every one of them, Evelyn, and that scared me half to death." The gun came down slowly. Her hand was shaking. The story of how they arrived at that moment in the road, facing each other over a drawn weapon, and the most honest declaration either of them had ever heard, began 7 months earlier in the autumn of 1883. When the stagecoach from Santa Fe rolled into Harrow's Crossing with a broken wheel and a woman who had nowhere left to go. Evelyn Finley was 28 years old when she stepped off that stage into the red dust of the New Mexico Territory, and she carried with her 2 trunks, a small leather satchel containing every document that proved she had once been a person with a life and a husband and a home, and the specific kind of grief that settles into a person's bones after they have buried someone, and then watched everything else fall apart in the months that followed. Her husband, Thomas Finley, had died of a lung infection in the spring of 1883, leaving behind a small amount of debt, a house in Santa Fe that the bank had been very patient but very firm about reclaiming, and Evelyn herself, who had been a schoolteacher before Thomas, and who discovered in the wake of his death that the world of 1883 had very particular ideas about what a woman alone ought to do next. She had tried to reclaim her teaching position in Santa Fe. The school board, composed of 4 men who all wore the same expression of polite condescension, had explained that they had filled her position and that they were certain she would find something suitable. What they meant was that they expected her to find another husband quickly, before she became a problem. Evelyn, who had always possessed a stubborn spine beneath her quiet exterior, had looked at all 4 of them with a steadiness that made 2 of them shift uncomfortably in their chairs, and she had thanked them for their time, and she had left, and she had not cried until she was 3 blocks away. The job posting for Harrow's Crossing had been tacked to a board outside the general store in Santa Fe, half hidden behind a notice about a lost mule. The new settlement needed a schoolteacher, someone willing to establish a proper schoolhouse, to bring some civilization and learning to a community of ranchers and miners, and the families that were beginning to follow them. The pay was modest. The accommodations were described as comfortable, which Evelyn correctly interpreted to mean serviceable. She had applied with a letter that was precise and professional, and did not mention the grief or the debt, or the particular desperation that had driven her to notice a posting she might otherwise have walked past. They had accepted her. The town council of Harrow's Crossing, which at that point consisted primarily of Mayor Horace Webb, who ran the general store and considered himself a great patron of civilization, had responded enthusiastically. They would provide a small house, a salary, and the materials necessary to begin the school in the spring. Evelyn had packed her 2 trunks and her satchel and her grief and her stubbornness, and she had boarded the stage to Harrow's Crossing, and the wheel had broken 6 miles outside of town, and by the time the replacement stage arrived and carried her the rest of the way, the sun was setting and the town was painting itself in shades of orange and rose that Evelyn might have found beautiful if she had not been so exhausted and so sad. The house they had provided was a small adobe structure on the eastern edge of town, 2 rooms, a fireplace, a bed that was slightly too short for her, and a window that looked out over a stretch of land that went on forever into the darkening sky. The woman who had been acting as temporary housekeeper for the town council, a broad and warm-hearted woman named Mrs. Arabella Crane, had stocked the kitchen with basic provisions and left a note of welcome that was so genuinely kind that Evelyn had stood over the small kitchen table and cried for the first time since she had cried 3 blocks from the Santa Fe school board. And then she had washed her face and unpacked one of the trunks and made herself a cup of tea on the small iron stove. She had arrived in September. By October, she had organized the space that Mayor Webb designated for the school, a large back room of the meeting house that smelled of wood smoke and old arguments, and she had sent for books and ordered slates and chalk from the supply catalog, and she had gone door to door through every home in Harrow's Crossing and the surrounding ranches to inform parents that the school would begin in November. She was good at this, the organizing, the planning, the quiet determination that had always been her natural mode of operating. She was less good at the loneliness, which was vast and particular and different from the grief, though they lived side by side in her chest and were sometimes difficult to distinguish from each other. Cecil Sutton rode into Harrow's Crossing on a gray October morning on a bay horse named Ranger, with a rifle across his saddle and 3 days of dust on his coat, and no particular reason for being there, except that it was the direction he had been heading, and he had run short of water 12 miles out, and the horse needed rest. He was 32 years old, and he had been drifting for 9 years, which was long enough that it had ceased to feel like a choice and begun to feel like a condition, like a particular configuration of personality and circumstance that simply was what it was. He had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers on a small ranch outside of San Antonio. His father was a hard man who loved his sons in the way that hard men often did, which was to say imperfectly and without much tenderness, but with a genuine ferocity that expressed itself in work and provision rather than in words. When Cecil was 23, a land dispute with a neighboring rancher named Devlin had escalated into violence, and Cecil's oldest brother had been killed, and the subsequent unraveling of everything, the legal battles that drained the family's resources, his father's declining health, the eventual loss of the ranch to the same Devlin who had started the whole tragedy, had left Cecil with a particular understanding of what it meant to build something and have it taken, and he had decided, quietly and completely, that he would not build anything that could be taken again. This was a dark past that he carried lightly, or appeared to. It had become the hidden motive behind every departure, every refusal to stay, every packed bedroll at dawn. He was good with horses, excellent with a rifle, skilled enough with carpentry and general labor to find work in almost any town he passed through, and he had passed through a great many of them. He had friends scattered across the territory, The way some men had furniture, familiar faces in specific places that he was always glad to see and always eventually left behind. He came to Harrow's crossing because he needed water and his horse needed rest, and he stayed for 3 days because the livery owner, a man named Gus Pelletier, offered him cash to help repair a fence line that had been damaged in an autumn storm. And he stayed a 4th day because something happened on the 3rd evening that he had not anticipated at all. He was eating dinner alone at the small establishment that served as both saloon and eating house in Harrow's Crossing, a place called the Dusty Nail that smelled of tobacco and rendered lard but made a surprisingly decent beef stew. And the door opened, and a woman came in who did not look like she belonged in a saloon but who clearly intended to be there regardless. She was carrying a stack of papers, and she went directly to the bar and spoke to the proprietor, a man named Hatch, in a tone that was courteous but contained an underlying firmness that Cecil recognized as the tone of someone who had learned that they needed to be firm first and courteous second, or the courtesy would be ignored entirely. He gathered from the conversation, which was not difficult to overhear in the small room, that she was the new schoolteacher, and that she was asking Hatch to post a notice about the school's opening date, and to pass the information to any families he knew of in the surrounding area. Hatch, who was not unfriendly but who had the particular discomfort of a man unsure how to treat an educated woman in his establishment, agreed somewhat awkwardly. The woman thanked him, set the papers on the bar with a precision that suggested she had organized many things in her life, and turned to leave. She nearly walked directly into Cecil, who had stood up to fetch himself another cup of coffee from the counter and had miscalculated the timing. They both stopped. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and there was a moment that was nothing more than the ordinary awkwardness of two strangers nearly colliding, except that her eyes were a particular shade of dark brown that seemed to contain something complicated in them, not sadness exactly, but an awareness of things that had cost something to learn, and Cecil, who had learned to read people the way trackers read terrain, saw it and was unexpectedly arrested by it. "Pardon me," he said. "No harm done," she said, and she went out the door. He stood there with his empty cup and watched the door swing closed, and then he went and got his coffee and sat back down and ate the rest of his stew, and he told himself that he was leaving in the morning and that it was none of his concern. He did not leave in the morning. He told himself he was staying another day because Gus had more fence work and the pay was good. This was true. It was not the whole truth. He saw her again 2 days later when he was outside the general store, and she came out carrying a box of supplies that was clearly heavier than she had anticipated. And he held the door and then, without quite planning to, offered to carry the box, and she accepted with the same practical directness she had shown at the bar. No false protest, no coyness, just a simple thank you and the direction of her house. It was a short walk, and they talked during it, the way strangers talk when they are carrying something together, about the town, about the weather, about the project of building a school in a place that had not had one before. She told him she had come from Santa Fe. He told her he had come from the direction of Albuquerque by way of several months of ranching work in the Eastern Territories. She asked him what brought him to Harrow's Crossing, and he said he was passing through, and she nodded as though she had expected that answer, and they reached her house and he set the box on her porch. "Thank you, mister," she said, and stopped. "Sutton," he said. "Cecil Sutton." "Thank you, Mr. Sutton," she said. "I am Evelyn Finley." He touched the brim of his hat and left, and he was annoyed to notice, as he walked back toward the livery where Ranger was stabled, that he was thinking about the way she had said his name, which was the same way she said everything, with a quiet precision that made you feel that the words had been selected carefully and meant exactly what they said. He left Harrow's Crossing 4 days later. He got 20 miles down the road toward Las Cruces and a dry wash that had no water in it, and he made camp under a sky that was, objectively, extraordinary, the way the sky always was when you were far enough from any settlement to see it properly. And he lay on his bedroll and looked at it, and thought about the way Evelyn Finley had looked at the box of supplies with the particular expression of a person calculating whether they had the strength for one more thing. He came back the next morning. He told himself and Gus Pelletier that he had reconsidered the additional fence work. October became November, and November was cold and brilliant in the New Mexico territory, and the school opened with 14 children of various ages crowded into the back room of the meeting house on a Tuesday morning. And Cecil watched from across the street as Evelyn Finley stood in the doorway of the meeting house with the morning sun on her face, and called the children in with a composure that suggested she had been doing this her whole life, even though he knew she had been doing nothing of the sort for the past year and a half. He had found more work. There was always more work in a growing town. He helped Gus with the livery expansion, took a week of work from the Miller Ranch 12 miles out repairing a barn roof, and was hired by Mayor Webb to help construct the new storage building behind the general store. He moved from his spot at the Dusty Nail into a rented room at the Crane House, where Mrs. Arabella Crane ran an informal boarding house with 3 other rooms that she rented to transient workers and the occasional traveling merchant. He told himself that he was staying because the work was steady, and the pay was fair, and the New Mexico winter was better tackled from a warm room than a bedroll. He ran into Evelyn Finley regularly, as was inevitable in a town of Harrow's crossing size. They talked. They talked with increasing frequency and increasing ease, the way 2 people talk when they have both been somewhat lonely and have discovered in each other a conversation that does not feel like labor. She was intelligent and particular in her opinions and unexpectedly funny in a dry, quiet way that crept up on you. And she had a habit of asking questions that were simple on the surface and revealed themselves as complex only after you had started to answer them. He told her about his years of drifting, about the different territories he had passed through, about the quality of the sky in different places, which was a subject he had opinions on that surprised him to discover he had opinions about. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a meticulous, organized mother who had drilled into her the conviction that a woman needed to be twice as competent as any man in the room simply to be taken half as seriously. She did not tell him about Thomas right away, and he did not ask about the ring she no longer wore but whose absence you could see if you looked at her left hand in certain lights. He did not tell her about Devlin and the ranch and his brother's grave in a Texas field, and she did not press him on the subject of why a man of obvious competence and intelligence had spent 9 years with no fixed address. They were both people with secrets that were not so much hidden as simply undisclosed, carried privately as things that had been processed, or nearly processed, and that did not need to be displayed. It was Mrs. Crane who told him about Thomas Finley, in the oblique way that Mrs. Crane conveyed most information, which was to say she brought it up while ostensibly talking about something else. She mentioned in the course of a conversation about the school that Evelyn had lost her husband in the spring, that it had been a terrible ordeal, and that the bank had been unkind about the house, and that Evelyn was doing extraordinarily well all things considered, and she looked at Cecil when she said the last part in a way that was not quite pointed but was not quite neutral either. Cecil received this information with a face that gave nothing away, thanked Mrs. Crane for the dinner she had just served him, and went to his room, where he lay on his back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about loss, and about how people carried it, and about whether the loneliness he had read in Evelyn Finley's eyes that first evening had been grief or something that had grown out of grief, something that was its own creature. He went to see her the following Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to return a book he had borrowed from her small collection, and she made him coffee and they sat by the window in her front room and talked for 3 hours, and it was in the middle of that conversation, which had moved from education to the nature of ambition to the question of what constitutes a home, that she told him about Thomas herself, directly and without fanfare, the way she did most things. She told him that Thomas had been a good man and that she had loved him, and that she still did in the way you love someone who is gone, which is different from the way you love someone who is present but is its own real thing. Cecil listened without interrupting, which was a gift he had not known he had until that afternoon. And then she asked him why he drifted, and he told her about the ranch. He told her about Devlin, about the dispute and the violence and his brother's death, about watching the thing his family had built over 30 years be dismantled in 18 months, about his father's face the day they had to leave, about the particular decision he had made in the aftermath that he would not put down roots that could be torn up again. He had not told this to many people. He did not know why he told it to her, except that there was something about the quality of her attention that made truth feel like the only appropriate response. She was quiet for a moment after he finished, and then she said, "That is a terrible reason to live the way you have been living," and the bluntness of it startled a short laugh out of him that sounded surprised even to his own ears. "You might be right," he said. "I know I am right," she said, "and so do you." They sat with that for a moment, the fireplace between them radiating heat in the cold November evening, and then they talked about other things, and the conversation moved on, but the thing that had been said remained in the room, present and unresolved in the way that true things often are. December came, and with it cold nights and the particular intimacy of a small community drawing inward against the weather. Cecil found himself at Evelyn's house with increasing regularity, helping with the heavier tasks that the house required, splitting and stacking firewood, repairing a section of the porch that had become unsafe, mending a leak in the adobe where the winter damp was seeping through. She always fed him when he came, and they always ended up talking long past when he had intended to leave. The children in her school adored her. He knew this because he watched them sometimes, going in and coming out, and because they talked about her the way children talk about someone who has made them feel important and capable, which is with a reverence that is entirely genuine. She told him that teaching was the thing she was most herself doing, and he believed her, because the way she talked about it was different from the way she talked about other things, more immediate and less guarded. The danger started in December as well, though at first it presented as a minor annoyance rather than a genuine threat. There was a man in Harrow's crossing named Rupert Grady, who ran a small cattle operation with 2 hired men on a ranch south of town. Grady was in his mid-40s, a widower himself, prosperous by local standards, and he had decided, with a directness that managed to be both flattering and alarming, that Evelyn Finley would make him an excellent second wife. He was not cruel exactly, but he was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he had the particular quality of a man who believed that his intentions were automatically honorable simply because they were his intentions. He began calling on Evelyn in December, bringing gifts that were practical and therefore harder to refuse, sacks of flour and sugar and a fine wool blanket, and making his interest clear in a way that left little room for graceful deflection. Evelyn handled him with the precision of a woman who had dealt with men who did not listen, politely and clearly telling him that she was not in a position to entertain a courtship at this time. "Thank you very much." Grady listened to this and seemed to interpret it as an invitation to try harder rather than as the definitive refusal it was. Cecil was present one afternoon in early December when Grady arrived at Evelyn's door, and he witnessed the exchange from the porch where he had been replacing a rotten board. Grady's eyes went from Evelyn to Cecil and back again, with a calculation that Cecil did not like, and there was something in the look that suggested Grady was beginning to construct a narrative in which Cecil Sutton was an obstacle rather than simply a man repairing a porch. After Grady left, Evelyn came back outside and looked at the porch board with an expression that was carefully neutral. "He will not simply go away," she said. "No," Cecil agreed. "I am not afraid of him," she said, "but he is the kind of man who could make things complicated." "What kind of complicated?" She folded her arms against the cold and looked out toward the south where Grady's wagon was receding. The kind who goes to Mayor Webb with concerns about the appropriateness of a single woman's living situation. The kind who makes it difficult for the school to continue receiving the town council's support. Cecil understood this perfectly. He had watched enough small communities to know exactly how this kind of social leverage operated, how a man with property and standing could make things very difficult for a woman who depended on community goodwill to do her work. It was a trap, the hidden kind, the kind that looked like concern from the outside and felt like a wall closing in from the inside. "Do you want me to stop coming by?" he asked, and the question cost him more than he showed. She looked at him then, and there was something direct and complicated in her expression. "No," she said, "I do not want that. What I want is to not be in a position where other people's opinions about my life are a weapon someone can use against me. But that is not something that has a simple solution." He thought about it on his walk back to the Crane house. He thought about it through the night. The next morning he went to see Mayor Webb. He was not sure, afterward, exactly how to characterize the conversation he had with Webb. He had gone in without a clear plan, except the general intention to understand how solid Evelyn's position in the community was, and to make clear, in whatever way seemed appropriate, that Cecil Sutton considered himself a member of the community in whatever capacity was needed. Webb, who was a shrewd man beneath his civic bluster, looked at Cecil with mild amusement and said that Miss Finley, as he called her, was a considerable asset to Harrow's crossing, and that the school was doing excellent work, and that the town council had no complaints whatsoever about her situation, and that as far as he was concerned, a woman who could teach 14 children of wildly different ages in a single room while also winning the confidence of their parents was worth 10 Rupert Grady's. Cecil had not known he needed to hear that said plainly by someone in authority until it was said. He reported this back to Evelyn that evening and watched her shoulders release a tension he had not noticed she was carrying. They had dinner together, which had become a regular occurrence without either of them officially declaring it so, and afterward she made coffee and they sat on opposite sides of the small fireplace, and she said, out of a silence that had been comfortable but was now becoming something else, "Cecil, what are your intentions?" He looked at her. "My intentions?" "It is a reasonable question," she said. "You have been here for 6 weeks. You are still here. You are making repairs to my porch and going to see my employer on my behalf. I would like to understand what you intend." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was coming down from the north and pushing against the windows, and the fire crackled and the coffee steamed. "I do not know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. "I have spent a very long time not intending to stay anywhere, and I am not certain I know how to do it differently." "That," she said, "is also a reasonable answer." And she did not push it further, and he did not know whether to be relieved or disappointed. January was brutal. The cold came down from the mountains with a severity that even the local ranchers described as worse than usual, and Harrow's crossing pulled in close, people helping each other with firewood and livestock, and the 100 small emergencies that winter in the territory produced. Cecil worked every day, whether it was shoveling out the livery after a snow, or reinforcing the meeting house roof against the weight of ice, or helping families in the outlying ranches when their animals needed moving to better shelter. He and Evelyn had a new configuration in the cold. She taught school in the mornings and spent her afternoons preparing lessons and mending, and doing the domestic labor of survival, and he fell into the rhythm of stopping by in the evenings with some regularity, and they ate together more often than not, and the conversations deepened into the kind that require a significant amount of trust to have at all. They talked about their deepest fears with the particular bravery of people who have decided, without saying so directly, that honesty is the only currency worth spending. She told him she was afraid of becoming invisible, of doing good work that no one saw or acknowledged until it quietly stopped mattering. He told her he was afraid of everything he loved being taken from him, and she said, quietly, that she understood that fear completely. One evening in mid-January, during the worst cold snap of the winter, they were sitting by her fireplace, and he was watching the snow come down outside her window, and he thought about all the nights he had been outside in weather like this, wrapped in his bedroll under whatever shelter he could find, watching exactly this kind of snow come down on open land, and he had always found it beautiful in a way that required no one else to witness it. And now he was inside, warm, with her presence on the other side of the fire, and the beauty of the snow was different, fuller somehow, more itself. "I have slept outside in weather like this," he said. "I know," she said, "more times than I could count, more nights under open sky than under any roof." She looked at him across the fire, and the snow was coming down outside and the firelight was on her face. "Did you prefer it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, at the particular way she watched him, without judgment and without agenda, just the genuine question of a person who wanted to understand. "I think I told myself I did," he said. "It was easier." "Then what?" He did not answer that directly. He said, "It is remarkable how much you can convince yourself you prefer something that is simply what you have." She set down her coffee cup and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Cecil," she said. "I know," he said. They did not say anything else about it that night, but something had shifted between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly, which was a kind of forbidden territory they were both orbiting without entering. February brought the crisis that neither of them had anticipated, but that, in retrospect, had been building since Grady's first visit. Grady had apparently decided that a more aggressive approach was warranted. He went to a member of the town council, a man named Patterson who had business dealings with Grady and was therefore susceptible to Grady's version of events, and he presented concerns about the schoolteacher's living arrangements and the propriety of the regular presence of a male laborer in her home after dark. Patterson brought this to Mayor Webb, who dismissed it. But Grady was not done. He had 2 hired men who were reliable in the particular way that hired men loyal to their employer's interests are reliable, which is to say they would do what they were asked within certain limits. One of these men was sent to the school on a Wednesday morning with a message for Evelyn that was just ambiguous enough to read as either a warning or a concerned observation, but was, unmistakably, a threat. The message was that Harrow's Crossing was a community that valued its standards, and that a woman in her position might want to consider what associations were doing to her reputation. Evelyn went directly from the schoolroom, where the children were practicing their letters under the supervision of the older student she trusted, to Cecil, who was at the livery with Gus. She told him what had happened with a controlled fury that he had not seen from her before, and it was more frightening than overt anger because it was so precise. He listened. He did not speak until she was finished. "He is trying to force your hand," he said. "He wants you to feel that your choices are to accept his protection or lose your position." "I understand that perfectly," she said. "What I do not know is what to do about it." "I do," Cecil said, and the simplicity of it surprised even him. He went to see Grady at his ranch. He rode Ranger out the 12 miles and he knocked on the door, and when Grady came out, Cecil said to him, without raising his voice or making any dramatic gestures, that he understood Grady had concerns about Miss Finley's situation, and that he was here to address those concerns directly. He told Grady that he intended to court Evelyn Finley properly and openly, and that if Grady had a problem with that, he was welcome to take it up with Cecil directly rather than through messengers and council members, and that he trusted Grady was a man of sufficient directness to appreciate this approach. Grady looked at him for a long moment with an expression that cycled through several phases, none of them particularly pleasant, and then he said that he supposed a man had the right to make his intentions clear, and that he had no quarrel with Cecil Sutton specifically, and that he would be withdrawing his concerns from the council's consideration. Cecil rode back to town and found Evelyn in her house and told her what he had done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You told him you intended to court me." "I did. Did you mean it?" He took his hat off and turned it in his hands, which she would learn over time was what he did when he was having a feeling he had not yet organized into words. "I believe I did," he said, "but I should have asked you first, and I am sorry for that." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "I accept your courtship, Mr. Sutton, on the condition that you are honest with me about your intentions as they develop, no disappearing before dawn without explanation." He met her eyes. "Agreed," he said. What followed was a courtship that was, in its own particular way, one of the most honest and therefore one of the most frightening things either of them had undertaken. They were not young people with the luxury of ignorance. They had both been places and lost things and developed the self-knowledge that comes from that kind of experience, and they both understood that what was building between them was significant and therefore dangerous. He took her on rides along the river on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, her on a gentle mare from Gus's livery and him on Ranger, and they talked and were sometimes quiet, and the silence was as comfortable as the conversation. He brought her small things that he saw and thought of her, a perfect piece of rose quartz from a dry creek bed, a book of poetry he found at the trading post and knew she would like, a carved wooden box made by a Navajo craftsman at the market that was just the right size for the collection of letters from her parents that she kept on her writing desk. She made him feel, for the first time in 9 years, that the accumulation of small things was worthwhile. That presence was not simply the time between departures. He told her, slowly and in pieces, more of himself than he had told anyone. He told her about the particular quality of sky he had found in the high desert of Arizona, orange and purple, and enormous over everything, and about a week he had spent in the mountains of Colorado when the autumn had turned the aspen groves gold, and the beauty of it had been almost unbearable in its absence of anyone to share it with. He told her about the loneliness that he had spent years convincing himself was freedom, and she listened to all of it with the same precise attention she gave everything. And she told him that she thought he had been extraordinarily brave in a way that had not been serving him, and that bravery that serves nothing is just suffering with good posture. He laughed at that, really laughed, the way you laugh at something that strikes you as profoundly true at the same moment it strikes you as funny. "You are the most honest woman I have ever met," he said. "I do not see the use in being anything else," she said. March came in warm and hopeful, and the school was thriving, and Evelyn had begun to speak with Mayor Webb about expanding it in the fall, perhaps building a proper schoolhouse rather than using the meeting-house room. Webb was enthusiastic. The town was growing, and a proper school was an emblem of stability, a declaration that Harrow's Crossing was not a temporary settlement but a real community with a future. Cecil had more work than he could take at this point. His reputation as a reliable and skilled laborer had spread well beyond Harrow's Crossing, and he was turning down jobs from ranches as far as 30 miles away. He was also beginning to realize, in the quiet of the evenings he spent with Evelyn or in the long mornings working, that something had happened to him that he had not planned and could not easily categorize. He loved her. He had been careful not to use that word even in his own internal accounting, but in March the word became unavoidable because it was simply true, and he was not a man who could indefinitely maintain a false accounting. He loved her intelligence and her humor and her stubbornness and her grief, and the way she held her coffee cup with both hands and the way she looked at the children in her school, and the way she had asked him, in January, with no pretense at all, what he intended. And the love terrified him, because his dark past had taught him with excruciating precision what it meant to love something and have it destroyed, and the betrayal of his own safety that loving required was not a small thing. It was the largest thing he had encountered in 9 years of very deliberate avoiding. The trap he had laid for himself became clear to him on a night in late March when he was lying awake in his room at the Crane house, and hearing Mrs. Crane's husband move through the house toward the kitchen for his nightly glass of water. The sound of a person moving through a space they have moved through so many times it has become part of their body, and Cecil felt the absence of that kind of belonging in himself as an actual physical sensation. A hollowness in the chest that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. He could leave. He could saddle Ranger and be gone before any of this became more complicated than it already was, before he hurt her or she hurt him, or the world intervened in some way neither of them could predict. He had left 100 times before. He was excellent at leaving. The thought of leaving, of not seeing her on Sunday afternoon, of not hearing her laugh at something he said, of returning to the sky and the stars and the particular freedom of belonging to nothing and nowhere, produced in him a feeling so desolate that he understood, lying in his bed in the Crane house in March of 1884, that he was already too far in to leave without damage. He told himself this was the problem. That he had waited too long, that he should have left in October while it was still possible. He told himself this for 3 days. On the 4th day he went to see Evelyn, and she was in her garden, which was mostly still winter bare, planning where she would put things in the spring, and she looked up at him when he came through the gate, and her face did the thing it had started doing recently when she saw him, opening slightly, warmth arriving before she had consciously decided to let it. And he stood there looking at her in her garden in the March sun, and thought that the sky he had slept under for 9 years was genuinely extraordinary, and that he would give every star in every one of those nights for this specific woman in this specific garden to be a permanent feature of his life. He did not say this yet. He was not ready, but he knew it was true. What he said was, "I thought I might help you plan the garden. I know a few things about what grows well in this soil." She looked at him with an expression that was tender and amused and slightly exasperated, the expression of someone who can see through a man's indirectness but is willing to let it play out. "That would be lovely," she said, and handed him a stick to draw in the dirt with. April was warm and full of wildflowers along the river, and Cecil built a proper fence around Evelyn's garden and helped her plant it, and they spent whole Saturday afternoons working in it side by side, dirty and sun-warm and comfortable in a way that required no ceremony or explanation. He taught her what he knew about the soil and the water table and the particular plants that thrived in the high desert, and she taught him, without explicitly teaching him anything, how to be in a place without always looking toward the horizon. Rupert Grady had withdrawn entirely from the situation, and the social threat he had represented had dissipated. He was seen in town occasionally, and he was civil to both of them in the way that a man is civil when he has accepted a defeat he considers beneath him to acknowledge openly. Cecil felt no particular triumph about this. He had not enjoyed the confrontation. He had simply done what was necessary to protect something he valued. It was in April that he kissed her for the first time. They had been coming back from a Sunday ride, and they had stopped on the ridge above the town, where the view opened out across the valley, red and green and extraordinary in the afternoon light, and she was looking at it with an expression of pure pleasure, and he turned to say something and did not say it, and she turned to see why he had not spoken and found him watching her, and the look between them was the final version of a conversation that had been going on since October, and he kissed her. And she kissed him back, and the valley spread out below them in the late April sun, and neither of them said anything for a while. On the ride back down to town, she said, "You stayed." "I did," he said. "You could have left in October. I could have." "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, the way she always made him think about things. "Because leaving would have required choosing to leave you specifically," he said, "and I could not do it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, and it is also completely backward as romantic gestures go." "I know," he said. "I am working on it." She laughed, and it was a sound he intended to spend the rest of his life hearing. May brought the decision that nearly ended everything. Cecil's old friend from his drifting years, a man named Clive Parsons, came through Harrow's crossing at the beginning of May with a proposition. Parsons was a man of Cecil's type and history, a drifter and a laborer, But where Cecil had been gradually rerouting himself in Harrow's crossing, Parsons had continued the life unmodified. He had a proposition for Cecil that was legitimate, a genuine paying contract for 6 months of work on a massive ranch operation in Wyoming Territory, good wages, the kind of money Cecil had not seen in years, and Parsons presented it with the enthusiasm of a man who still believed that the horizon was the best possible destination. Cecil took 3 days to give Parsons an answer. During those 3 days he was quiet in a way that Evelyn noticed immediately. She did not press him, but she watched him, and he could feel her watching. And on the second night they were having dinner, and she finally set down her fork and said, "Whatever you are deciding, you should know that the deciding is visible." He told her about the offer. He told her honestly what it represented in terms of money and opportunity, and also what it represented in terms of his old life, the life that had been his for 9 years, the version of himself that was free and uncommitted and answerable to nothing but weather and conscience. She listened to all of it. She did not tell him what to do. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want both things," he said, "which is not possible." "No," she said, "it is not." He turned down Parsons. He told him the next morning. Parsons shook his head with the particular expression of a man who has watched a friend make a choice he himself would never make. And he wished Cecil well and rode out of Harrow's crossing by noon. And Cecil watched him go from in front of the livery and felt the pull of the road the way you feel a tide, real and physical. And he stood in it until it passed, and then he went back to work. He told Evelyn he had turned it down, and she looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Thank you for being honest with me about it." "Always," he said, and meant it. June brought heat and the blooming of Evelyn's garden and the close of the school year, and with the school year's close came a kind of expansiveness in both of them, a loosening of the rhythms that had structured their months. They spent more time together freely, riding and walking and sitting in the evenings on her porch watching the light change over the valley. And it was in this expansiveness that the question of what came next became something neither of them could continue to defer. He had been in Harrow's crossing for 8 months. He had a reputation, a place in the community, more work than he could take. Ranger was in a permanent stall at Gus's livery. He had accumulated, almost without noticing, the furniture of a life, a community, a skill set being applied to a specific and growing place, a woman he loved. He had not used the word love to her yet. He was building toward it with the precision of a man who knows that a thing said aloud becomes real in a way that a thing thought only in private does not. The night of the summer solstice, June 21st, 1884, he took her to the ridge above the valley where they had first kissed, and they sat on a blanket in the warm dark and watched the sky, which was the sky he had watched from the ground for 9 years, enormous and blazing with stars, the Milky Way clear across the middle of it, the particular extravagance of the desert sky that you could never adequately describe to anyone who had not seen it. She lay back on the blanket and looked up at it and said, "It is astonishing." "It is," he said. "I have seen it from a bedroll more times than I can count." She turned her head to look at him. He looked back at her, and the stars were above them both, and he said the thing that had been true since January, or maybe since October, or maybe since the first time he had seen the complicated knowledge in her eyes in the dusty nail and been unable to walk away. "I have slept under more stars than roofs," he said, "and I would trade them all." She was still for a moment, and then she reached out and took his hand, and her fingers were warm and certain, and he turned his hand to close around hers. "Cecil," she said, "I know it is not the most conventional declaration," he said, "but it is the truest one I have." "It is the truest one I have ever heard," she said. And she turned toward him, and he turned toward her, and the stars blazed above them in the warm June dark, and everything was exactly as it was, and as it should be, and as neither of them had dared to let themselves want. He proposed to her in July. It was not a dramatic production, because Evelyn was not a woman who would have wanted a dramatic production, And because the truth was that by July the proposal was less a question than a confirmation of something they had both already decided. He came to her on a Thursday evening with a ring he had purchased from a traveling jeweler who had passed through Harrow's crossing the previous week. A simple gold band with a small setting of turquoise that had caught his eye, because the color reminded him of the New Mexico sky at the specific hour when it is neither quite day nor quite night. And he sat across from her at her kitchen table and said that he would like to spend the rest of his life in her company, and that he understood if that proposition required more demonstration than 8 months of choosing to stay in Harrow's crossing, and that he intended to demonstrate it for as long as it took. She put the ring on her own finger and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him with an expression that was both more serious and more luminous than anything he had seen on her face before, and she said, "The demonstration is noted and accepted. Yes." They were married in Harrow's crossing in August of 1884, in the meeting house that had served as a school, in a ceremony performed by the circuit preacher, who came through the territory every 6 weeks, and who declared, upon meeting them, that he had rarely been asked to marry two people who so clearly knew their own minds. The whole town came. Mrs. Crane wept with a thoroughness that was entirely characteristic. Mayor Webb gave a speech that was mercifully short. Gus Pelletier brought Ranger from the livery wearing a brushed coat and a new bridle that he had put on the horse as a joke, and then left on because it looked impressive. Even Rupert Grady attended, sitting in the back with the expression of a man who has made his peace with something and is mildly interested in demonstrating the fact. Evelyn wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the catalog in Santa Fe, a deep blue the color of a clear winter sky, and she stood in the sunlight coming through the meeting-house windows and said her vows with the same quiet precision she said everything, as though each word had been selected for its exact truth, and she intended every one of them. Cecil said his vows and felt them settle into his chest like something coming home, like the particular rightness of a thing that has been moving toward its place for a long time and has finally arrived. They celebrated with the community for the better part of the afternoon, and when the party wound down and the neighbors and friends dispersed, and the evening came in warm and gold over the valley, they went home to the house that had been hers and was now theirs together, the small adobe house with the garden and the porch, and the window that looked out over the land that went on forever into the sky. He stood on the porch in the evening light and looked out over that land, and she came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and the stars were beginning to come out in the east, faint and distant and growing. "I used to look at this kind of sky from the ground," he said. "I know," she said. "It was extraordinary. And now," he looked at her, and then he looked out at the sky, and then he pulled her closer. "Better," he said simply. The fall of 1884 was the beginning of a life that was, in its dailiness, far richer than either of them had been prepared for. Evelyn reopened the school in September with 18 children, 4 more than the previous year, and began the serious planning and fundraising for the dedicated schoolhouse that Mayor Webb had approved in principle. Cecil took on a primary role in the construction, working with the hired men that the town council provided funds for and applying his considerable skill to the project with the particular energy of a man who is building something for a reason he believes in. The schoolhouse went up through September and October, a proper structure with windows on both sides for light, a real stove, shelving for books along the back wall, and a porch wide enough for children to stand on in bad weather while waiting for the school day to begin. He built a low cabinet at exactly the right height for Evelyn to store her teaching materials, and he put her initials in the wood of it, carved small and precise, because he was a man who had begun to understand that small permanent things were not traps but gifts. Evelyn discovered she was pregnant in October. She told him in the same direct way she told him everything, sitting across the kitchen table with her coffee cup between her hands, and she watched his face as she said it. What she saw there was something she would remember for the rest of her life, a sequence of emotions moving through his gray eyes too quickly to name individually, and at the end of the sequence, something that settled and held, something she could only describe as the final departure of an old fear. He put his hand over hers on the table. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also terrified and delighted in approximately equal proportions." "That sounds exactly right," he said. The baby came in June of 1885, a boy, strong and loud, and possessed from the first moments of an expression that Evelyn said was unmistakably his father's. That particular quality of looking at everything with an assessing thoroughness that saw more than it immediately revealed. They named him James Thomas Sutton, James after Cecil's grandfather and Thomas for Evelyn's late husband, a decision that Cecil had offered without her asking, and that had made her cry, a thing she did not often do, and that he witnessed with the gravity it deserved. James Thomas Sutton grew like a weed in the New Mexico sun, and he was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Clara, who had Evelyn's dark eyes and her mother's fierce precision, and who, at 2 years old, was already organizing her toys into categories by a logic that seemed entirely coherent to her even if it remained opaque to everyone else. The schoolhouse became the finest building in Harrow's Crossing, and by 1887 Evelyn was teaching 32 children and had petitioned the territory's Department of Education for a second teacher and an expanded curriculum. The territory sent a young woman named Miss Hughes, who arrived from Colorado with a trunk full of books and an earnest enthusiasm that Evelyn directed with the efficiency of a general deploying a particularly willing recruit. Cecil built them a larger house in 1886, on the same lot as the original adobe, which they kept as a guest cottage for when Evelyn's parents came from Ohio, which they did twice in the first 5 years. Her father arriving the first time with the air of a man prepared to be skeptical of his daughter's choice, and departing with the air of a man who was primarily interested in when he could return to visit his grandchildren. Her mother, who was meticulous and organized, and therefore understood Cecil immediately because he was also meticulous and organized, approved of him from the first afternoon, and told Evelyn privately that she had chosen well, which was high praise from a woman who did not offer praise loosely. Gus Pelletier sold Cecil Ranger outright in 1885, a transaction that had been technically unnecessary since Cecil had been the horse's primary caretaker for 2 years, but that felt important to formalize. Ranger lived in the proper stable that Cecil built behind the new house, well-fed and comfortable, and on Sunday morning Cecil still rode him along the river valley, sometimes alone and sometimes with Evelyn when they could arrange it around the children. There were hard times, as there are always hard times in the territory and in life. A drought in 1888 that stretched 2 years and made the garden difficult, and the surrounding ranches harder, and Cecil worked long hours during those years, helping the ranching community with water management and cattle movement with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. Evelyn organized a community effort to share resources and provide for the families whose income had been most severely affected, which required all of her considerable organizational skill and a persistence that wore down 3 separate city council members who initially resisted the expenditure of public funds. James, at 3 years old during the drought, was too young to understand fully but remembered the particular quality of the household during those years, the careful attention to resources, the stream of neighbors in and out of the house, his parents' constant activity, and the way they were tired but never defeated. The drought broke in the fall of 1890 with rains that came first gentle and then overwhelming, and the valley turned green in a way that people in Harrow's Crossing described for years afterward, as though the land had been waiting and the waiting was over. Evelyn found Cecil standing at the window on the first morning of those rains, watching it come down, and she put her hands on his back and felt him breathe. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking that I used to travel hundreds of miles to see things beautiful," he said, "and now all the beautiful things are in one place." She pressed her face against his back briefly, the way she did sometimes when something he said was too large for any other response. "James is awake," she said after a moment. "I know," he said. "I can hear him. He sounds very concerned about something." "He always does," Cecil said, with the particular mixture of amusement and pride that characterized everything he felt about his son. He turned away from the window and went to his son, and Evelyn watched him go and thought about the man who had come into the Dusty Nail on an October evening in 1883 with dust on his coat, and no reason to stay. And she thought about all the distances he had traveled to arrive in this room on this rainy morning. And she thought that the world was an astonishing place for the way it sometimes assembled things exactly right. In the spring of 1891, Cecil was offered a position on the Harrow's Crossing Town Council by Mayor Webb, who was stepping back from some of his civic duties, and who told Cecil, with the frankness of a man who had watched him for 8 years, that the community needed people who understood both labor and leadership, and that Cecil had demonstrated both with sufficient consistency to have earned the appointment. Cecil accepted with a genuine humility that surprised the other council members, most of whom had expected either more eagerness or more resistance. He said at his first meeting that he was there to make the community better for the families who depended on it, and that he intended to listen more than he spoke, at least at first. This policy of listening distinguished him immediately from the majority of his colleagues and earned him, over the next year, a reputation for being the council member most worth talking to. He used his position to advocate successfully for the expansion of the school, for improvements to the water supply infrastructure that had been inadequate since the drought, and for a set of policies regarding the treatment of the Navajo and Apache families who traded in the area that moved toward something more like fairness than the previous arrangements had managed. This last effort was not uncontroversial, and it required the full deployment of Cecil's patience and Evelyn's ability to frame moral arguments in practical terms, but it passed by a vote of 3-2, and Cecil considered it the most significant thing he accomplished in his first term on the council. Evelyn's school received its full territorial certification in 1891, one of the first schools in the territory to do so, and Miss Hughes was promoted to co-principal, a designation that Evelyn had invented and that the territory accepted with only mild administrative confusion. There were now 44 children in the school, requiring the construction of a second room, which Cecil organized and built with a volunteer crew over a spring weekend that turned into a community event, people bringing food and children playing around the construction site, and the building going up with a collaborative energy that Cecil thought about for years afterward as one of the best days of his adult life. On the evening after the building was complete and the crew had gone home and the children were in bed, Evelyn and Cecil sat on their porch in the spring dark and drank cold water because it was still warm from the day's work, and the stars were out in their customary abundance over the valley. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The drifting?" He considered the question with his usual honesty. "Sometimes," he said. "I miss the particular freedom of having no responsibilities." "In the way you sometimes miss things that were not good for you. That is an honest answer. You require those," he said. She smiled. "Was I difficult about it when we first met?" "You were exacting," he said. "It was terrifying and completely necessary," she laughed. "I was grieving and frightened, and I had learned that the world did not give you anything for being tentative, so I decided to be clear. You saved me from a very long continued mistake," he said. "The mistake of thinking that a life with nothing to lose in it is the same as a life without pain." She looked at him. "It is not the same at all." "No," he said. "It is not." They sat with that for a while, in the comfortable silence of people who have spent years building a vocabulary for the things that matter and no longer need to fill every quiet moment with words. In the summer of 1893, Evelyn became pregnant again, and in March of 1894, they welcomed a second son, whom they named Walter after Cecil's father. Walter was a quieter child than James had been, observant where James was active, and he had from the first weeks a watchful quality that was so distinctly Cecil's that people who had known Cecil in his drifting years, mostly through Gus Pelletier's stories about the early days, said they could see it immediately. Clara, at 7, was deeply interested in her new brother in a manner that combined genuine affection with the organizational impulse that had always been central to her personality, and she devised a system of care for Walter's toys and clothing that was so comprehensive that Evelyn used it as a model for organizing the school's supply closet, which had been a source of frustration for 3 years. James, at 9, was more ambivalent about the new baby in the way that 9-year-olds are ambivalent about anything that redistributes the household's attention. But his father sat with him one evening and talked to him about the value of brothers in a way that was informed by everything Cecil had lost and everything he had rebuilt. And James, who was perceptive in the specific way that children of perceptive parents often are, understood more of what was behind the words than Cecil had entirely intended, and he was good with Walter from then on. The town of Harrow's Crossing grew steadily through the 1890s, and the life that Cecil and Evelyn had built within it grew with it. He served 3 terms on the town council and declined a 4th on the grounds that fresh perspectives were healthier than long incumbencies, a position that Webb, who had been on the council in some capacity for 15 years, received with mixed feelings. Cecil stepped back to a role as a building contractor and craftsman, taking commissions from the expanding community and from ranches and settlements across a 50-mile radius, work that he did with 3 hired men and a level of quality that people recognized and sought out. Evelyn ran the school until 1898, when James was 13 and Clara was 11 and Walter was 4, and she handed the day-to-day operation to Miss Hughes, who had by then become simply Margaret, her close friend and the school's co-principal in actual practice as well as designation, and she moved into a role as the school's director, handling the administrative and political work of keeping the institution funded and recognized and growing. It was a role that suited her specific combination of skills exactly, and she was better at it than anyone, including herself, had anticipated. There were years of particular happiness and years of particular difficulty, because that is the nature of a life lived in a real place with real people over a real span of time. There were illnesses that passed and illnesses that were more serious, and there was the general hardship of the territory in the late 19th century, and there were losses, people they loved who died and left gaps that did not close but that you learned to live around, the way you live around missing furniture in a room, knowing where the piece should be but no longer tripping over its absence. Cecil's mother died in 1892 in San Antonio, and he went back to Texas for the first time in 10 years to bury her and to see his surviving brothers, and he came back from that trip looking like a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a very long time, lighter and sadder and more whole than when he left. But the central fact of their life was the central fact of what they had built, the school and the house and the community, and the particular conversation that had been going on between them since October of 1883, which was ongoing and still extraordinary to both of them for its quality and its range, and the way it remained interesting decade after decade. He told her once in 1896, lying in the dark after the children were long asleep, that he thought about the night he almost left in October of 1883 and felt sick at the thought of it, at the nearness of a life in which he had simply ridden on. "You would have turned around eventually," she said. "I did not have anything to turn around for," he said. "I would not have known what I was missing." "That is the worst kind of loss," she said, "the kind you do not know about." He reached for her hand in the dark. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." In 1899, with the century ending and James 16 and Clara 14 and Walter 5, Cecil and Evelyn did something that surprised their children and most of their neighbors. They took a trip. They arranged for James, who was responsible beyond his years, to manage the household with Mrs. Crane's adult daughter helping, and they got on the train from the nearest station, which was now connected to Harrow's crossing by a proper road that Cecil had been instrumental in building, and they went west to California to see the ocean, which neither of them had ever seen. Evelyn stood on a beach outside of San Diego and watched the Pacific Ocean come in across the sand. And the scale of it, the sheer impossible scale of water going all the way to the horizon and continuing, moved her to a silence that lasted for several minutes, which was unusual for a woman who was rarely without words. Cecil stood beside her and watched her watch the ocean, and he thought that he had seen a great deal of the world's extraordinary offerings, deserts and mountains and rivers and skies, and that the best view he had ever had was of Evelyn Finley in the particular state of being overwhelmed by something beautiful. "Well," he said. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright. "It is not better than the stars," she said, "but it is different." "High praise," he said. "Everything has its own beauty," she said. "The ocean and the stars and the desert and the mountains, they are all true." She looked at him with the expression that was only his, the specific illumination that had been his since the first time she had turned it on him fully, on a ridge above the valley with the spring valley spread below them. "You are also true," she said. He took her hand. There on the beach in California with the Pacific arriving and arriving in its endless patient way, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stood there for a long time in the good bright air. They went home to Harrow's crossing, to the house and the school and the 3 children, and the community that they had built together from the raw material of 2 people who had been separately uncertain whether building anything again was a risk worth taking. They went home on the train, watching the desert open up as California gave way to Arizona and then New Mexico, the red rocks and the wide sky, and the particular quality of light that was theirs, the light of the place where they had arrived and stayed and become permanent. Cecil looked out the train window at the New Mexico territory unrolling outside and felt, as he always felt returning from anywhere, the specific happiness of a man who has somewhere that is genuinely his, not by possession but by love and labor and years of choosing the same place again and again. "Almost home," Evelyn said, looking up from the book she had been reading. "Almost," he agreed, and looked out at the sky, which was in the golden hour now, the light slanting long and amber over the land, making everything luminous and still. They arrived in Harrow's crossing as the sun was going down, and James was at the station with the wagon, tall and self-possessed at 16, in a way that made Cecil's chest ache with something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but lived between them. And Clara was beside him with Walter on her hip. And Walter, seeing his parents, lunged forward with the full physical enthusiasm of a 5-year-old who has decided that the greeting should be comprehensive. And Evelyn caught him and held him and laughed, and Cecil took James's hand and shook it as he had started doing recently, man to man, and James smiled the smile that was Evelyn's, the one that arrived quietly and stayed. They drove home through the town in the last of the evening light, the street lamps being lit by the man who did it every evening now that Harrow's crossing had proper street lamps, and the houses, and the schoolhouse, and the general store, and the Dusty Nail, which was now a proper restaurant as well as a saloon, and all the accumulated evidence of 2 decades of community life passed by the windows of the wagon. That night, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Cecil and Evelyn sat on their porch in the October dark, a full circle from the October when he had arrived with dust on his coat and no reason to stay, and the stars were out in their full, magnificent excess over the valley. She had her coffee cup between her hands. He had his beside him on the porch rail. The night was warm for October, the way the nights sometimes were in the New Mexico territory, a last gift of warmth before the cold came. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the conversation you had with James before we left. About the fact that he will make his own choices about where to live and what to do, and that some of those choices will be to leave." "Yes," he said, "that is the nature of it. Does it frighten you, the way it frightened you before, watching something you love go?" He thought about it honestly, the way she had always required. "It is different," he said. "When something is taken from you, it leaves a wound. When someone grows and leaves because they are ready to, it leaves a different kind of mark. Something more like pride than grief." She was quiet, looking at the stars. "You have changed," she said, "from the man who rode in on the bay horse." "For better, I hope," he said. "Immeasurably," she said. "And so have I." He reached over and took her hand, as he had done 10,000 times in 16 years, and it was still exactly right, the fit of it, the warmth, the specific certainty of it. "I was thinking today on the train," he said, "about the night on the ridge, the solstice, what I said." "About the stars," she said. "I meant it completely," he said. "Every word. I had seen so much of the sky. I had lain on the ground in places that were genuinely magnificent, and I had looked up at it alone, and it was beautiful, and it was free, and it was mine. And none of it, none of any of it, was worth one morning in this house. Not one." She turned to look at him, and her face in the starlight was the same face he had first seen in the dusty nail, and that had been the gravitational center of his life for 16 years, a little older and therefore more fully itself, every year adding to it something that deepened rather than diminished. "You already told me that," she said, "on the ridge." "I know," he said. "I will keep telling you, until you are tired of hearing it." "I will never be tired of hearing it," she said. They sat on the porch under the stars, the two of them, in the house they had built and the life they had chosen, in the town that had become their country, and the night was wide and warm around them, and the stars were exactly as brilliant as they had always been, and more beautiful now for all the things that lived beneath them. James Sutton would leave Harrow's Crossing at 20 to study law in Albuquerque, and he would be extraordinary at it. And he would come home every Christmas and every summer for the rest of his parents' lives, because home was the kind of place he had been raised to understand the value of. Clara would stay, as Clara had always intended to stay, and she would eventually take over the running of the school from her mother, with an organizational efficiency that made even Evelyn stop and marvel at how the child had surpassed the teacher. Walter, youngest and most watchful, would become a botanist, improbably and wonderfully, studying the plant life of the territory with a thoroughness that his father recognized as his own best quality in a new medium, and he would publish papers in journals that Evelyn kept in a stack on the shelf beside the dictionary, ordered by date. But all of that was ahead of them in the October dark, the future folded and waiting. And for now there was only the porch and the coffee and the stars and the warmth and the 16 years of every chosen morning, all the small permanent things that together made something that no force had been able to take. Because it was not built from land or money or circumstance, but from the accumulated and ongoing decision of two people to be honest with each other about the things that mattered and to choose each other again and again, which is the only structure that is genuinely permanent. "Come inside," she said, eventually. "It is getting cold." He looked up at the stars one more time, the full, enormous sky of the New Mexico territory, the sky he had slept under for 9 years and loved in the specific way you love something that asks nothing of you, and he looked at it with gratitude rather than longing, the way you look at a version of yourself that was not wrong but was not finished. "Coming," he said, and stood, and took her hand, and went inside, and closed the door on the night, and the stars continued their great patient burning over the valley where they lived.